I recognize the honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So here we are again. Here we are again. I'm going to speak to this bill because, you know, we know that it's been concerning from the start. And I think this is a pattern here when we bring legislation forward that doesn't have an equitable lens and isn't inclusive of all Nova Scotians. So what we see is that it allows the province to unilaterally steamroll HRM. And I mean, I'm not a counselor, and I know that their job is extremely challenging, like our own job. But I mean, they often develop their bylaws in close consultation with the communities that they serve across this province. And so the government has said that the intention of this bill is to speed up development, build faster. It sounds like a broken record, because this is what they've said about Bill 225 that we passed last year around this time. And I'm just curious, and we haven't had any answers to that as well. What has happened in a year? I mean, the data doesn't show any new builds that people are actually turnkey, going inside, living. You know, we have high rates of homelessness. People are being evicted every day. And so, you know, I really am very concerned about, you know, the intention of this bill and how it affects HRM. I mean, specifically as an HRM MLA, I'm very, very concerned about that. We know that, you know, it sounds like the real impetus to this bill is to consolidate control. And what does that mean? When someone has complete control, it means they should be responsible for all of the things that are happening. And within a year of the complete control of the previous bill, I haven't seen very much action on that. So this is why our caucus has opposed this bill at every stage. This is also why Black communities in HRM and across the province have been greatly alarmed by the speedy progress of this bill, by the speedy progress of all the bills that we put forward that are not designed with an equitable lens, that we do not look at it from the point of view of all Nova Scotians. So this bill, with no safeguards for communities like Lucasville, like Beachville, like East Preston, Lake Loon, North Preston, Birchtown, all of these rural areas in which consultation is consistently done when municipalities have these conversations and they're looked at from that point of view. This is very concerning when we put bills forward that have no equitable lens. So we know that these communities, the Black communities in which I'm talking about, experience great pressure from developers who have been engaged in careful community-based planning, because we spoke to this in our last bill when we said, you know, there's a lot of encroachment happening on these communities' land. There is expropriation happening on these Black communities' lands, that now we have a land titles initiative to give folks back their land that is rightfully theirs because it's been encroached upon decades, centuries, over time, and we are continuing to allow this happen. And by this bill, it's concerning. So when people have come to law amendments, when we hear from people and we're listening to our communities, these are the words that they're saying because they're concerned about their own well-being and their own concern for their communities that we see consistently are being encroached upon. So in the previous bill a year ago, the African Nova Scotian Decade for People of African Descent Coalition wrote an open letter with their concerns and specifics to be put into a bill so that we know, because when it's legislated, it's law, so that we know that these things won't happen. They asked for mandatory consultation with the African Nova Scotian communities, an advisory board of African Nova Scotian members from all HRM historic African Nova Scotian communities when any application for deeds or development is proposed in all historic African Nova Scotian communities. So I can tell you that I've looked at the bill and I've read line by line. I've kind of went back and forth on the bill that was proposed and the bill previous, and it doesn't say any of that. It actually has no indication of safeguards for African Nova Scotian communities. So, to their credit, in the previous bill, they did make a change to the bill. It was a knee-jerk reaction because, you know, they had to do something and it had to be done. But this bill doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't have any wording in it at all. So it will override that particular bill before that, which in turn, pretty much it doesn't acknowledge anything that was just fought for in the previous bill. So, which will override and overrule that previous bill. So, historic African Nova Scotian communities are very concerned that this could nullify the hard work of listening and consulting. We need a government. We should be that government that respects community voices and not steamrolls them, because that's what we see. I mean, it's one thing for us to have debate and go back and forth and talk about our concerns and how we feel, because we are representatives of our riding. But it's another thing to completely disregard and disrespect the people that are doing the work on the ground and not even include anything that they say in the work that we do. So, we need a government that respects community consultation and the democratic process. So we heard many times that, the democratic process is what we see here in this legislature over the past. I mean, I've only been sitting for 2 years, and I'm kind of like, when are we going to collaborate? Like, when are we going to talk about bills? Like, I mean, I don't know. I would like to think that we can have input and things can be done, but it's like, it's really like disheartening, because I mentioned in my previous talk when I stood up here on Friday, and I was like, I didn't even get a heads up. Like, I'm getting calls about what's going on with Bill 329 and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I have no idea. I didn't get a call. I'm an MLA, but I don't know. So for me, it's really like, when are we going to start acting like colleagues and like coworkers here? Because for me, I mean, in order for me to help you do your work and get work done properly, we should be working collectively. So let's consider something here. I just kind of want to say, this because I need this to be known. And I may sound like a broken record, but apparently this is what's happening. We're getting the scratches all the time because it seems to be going back around. I feel like I'm a DJ going back around to the same attitude and behavior that is not productive and actually distrustful and disrespectful. So I want to say, in order to build diversity within this house, we need to be equitable and inclusive. Equity is what we need to get people in this door, and inclusion is what keeps them. Equity removes those barriers, while inclusion fosters safety and belonging. You have to start with equity and inclusion for diversity to be sustainable. I say this because every bill that has been put forward by this government has not been examined by an equitable lens. I will stand up here every single time a bill gets put up here when we don't examine it in a way that is equitable and inclusive to all Nova Scotians. Nova Scotians are not made with one brush. We have a number of people in our province that are here because they love being here, are here because they were raised here. Like, we need to start thinking about that when we sit here and design legislation that is supposed to be for all Nova Scotians. So, furthermore, if equity and inclusion are the drivers for diversity, I gotta say it, because whenever I feel like when we're here, I'm like, this is a really good opportunity for us to do great work. If equity and inclusion are the drivers for diversity, then it's crucial for us to recognize and speak to our differences in order to do that work well. So it might be uncomfortable, and I know sometimes when you see me stand up, you go, oh, here we go. Suzy's gonna say something. I'm gonna say something. It might go against everything we've learned, because sometimes we have to unlearn the bad behaviors that we've learned previously. We have to change. We have to do things differently. So getting back to the bill, how does this play out in the actions of this government when you put forward bills that are structurally discriminatory, with no consult or regard to the African Nova Scotian communities? I also have to say that, once again, we see a government who puts forward pieces of legislation that speaks to just this issue: discrimination and anti-Black racism. No one, and I said this last time, I can't understand why no one on that side of the government is even thinking about, you know what, how's that going to affect the African Nova Scotian community? How's it going to affect the Indigenous community? How's it going to affect, our Indian community? How's it going to affect, like, no one is thinking of these things. And maybe you are, you're just not saying it. I just got to say that. So once again, we see this. We see this happening, and it's very, very troubling. No one thought this was a bad idea. And the fact that we, again, continue to have bills like this on this table is very disturbing and disrespectful and discriminatory. So when this government was proud, and I'll say it again, of the Dismantling Racism and Hate Act, I mean, I would kindly suggest that we should take this information in, because it's not a good look for this government when you don't practice what you preach. We have a government that says, oh, we got a piece of legislation here, first of its kind. I said this last, I feel like I'm a broken record again. First of its kind. And yet we see bills that are being disrespectful, discriminatory against African Nova Scotian communities. So in the act, it is recognized that marginalized and racialized individuals and communities in Nova Scotia experience harmful and unjustifiable inequities and disparities because of systemic hate, inequity, and racism. And systemic hate, inequity, and racism is often caused by government and public body policies, practices, and procedures that appear neutral but have an effect of what? Disadvantaging marginalized and racialized groups, and can be perpetuated by a failure to identify, monitor, and correct those disparities and the inequities, which is in front of us today again. Again, we didn't learn from the first time. We back here again talking about inequities and disparities of African Nova Scotian communities. So the government states that in this act, which is the previous act, that eliminating systemic hate, inequity, and racism and advancing racial equity supports the economic success and well-being of society, and everyone benefits when individuals and communities are no longer marginalized. We all need to truly believe that this is what we believe in. Like when we see pieces of legislation that once again completely disregard groups of people and communities, it is very, very troubling, especially when, we think of what the effects could be. We've had letters from community. We've heard from HRM counselors. We've heard from people on the ground. I know for a fact, a number of the MLAs on the government side have received emails, especially CC'd from my office, that have said just that. And yet we received amendments, and the amendments aren't even touching what we've heard and what we've seen. So I'm not going to go into all this other stuff, but I will say this. Okay. Because, I get a little built up here. I'm like, okay, so, and this act is intended to establish, the act itself is intended to establish a commitment by the government to address systemic hate, inequity, and racism to enhance us, all of us, in the well-being of Nova Scotians. So in this case, are we committed to continuing this harm or addressing it as we stated as we continue on this discussion? Because we can address it at any time. We could address it in clause by clause by clause. But until it's embedded in legislation, we are ignoring the fact that this can harm folks in these communities. So, as we know, the minister is responsible for the supervision and management of the act. And so my question is today that, we have an office that specifically addresses these concerns, and a minister, gratefully, that is responsible and is accountable to Nova Scotians, who has colleagues sitting next to them. I would hope that these are the conversations that are being had by all departments, because this is what the bill says. That's what that bill stated. That's what the responsibility of government is to do. And yet we see bills here that are not doing that. So I would hope that when we see these next bills, and I hope to see some amendments that will speak to just that, and if not, it is a disservice to Nova Scotians in this province, because what we're doing is completely disregarding a historical black communities in Nova Scotia. So we know that the government is to achieve equity and anti-racism and to eliminate disparities, hate, and inequity that negatively impact marginalized and racialized individuals and communities in the province. And I say here today that this bill it's doing just that. And the communities have spoke to that this is not what they want. to raise awareness of the importance of equity and anti-racism and elements that contribute to equity and anti-racism. How is this supposed to happen if we don't even follow our own legislation? When it comes to the business of this House, we need to do better. And we need to open our eyes to the harms that this speaks of. Our African Nova Scotian communities deserve better. And I'm raising awareness as we speak, so I hope we are all listening. Oh my. Well, you know what? We know that a part of that particular act is to evaluate existing policy to address systemic hate and inequity and racism. And I'm curious to know, was that the case with this bill? Did the minister confer with her colleagues about how this was not a good idea? Did other members talk about, you know, how can we do better for the African Nova Scotian communities, our Indigenous communities, our communities across the province? Like, I'm curious to know what has been happening when legislation is being created and brought forward here in this House. Our government, and this is a statement, our government is committed to eliminating systemic hate, inequity, and racism, and the achievement of equity and anti-racism is a shared responsibility among governments, the private sector, and all Nova Scotians. So these are all really, really wonderful words, and these are words to stand by. It's unfortunate that by what we see here today and what we've seen over the past little bit, that is not the case. And people are noticing it. People are hearing and listening and seeing, and we have a due diligence to make sure that it is stated and done and worked out within legislation that's here in this House. We also need to appreciate the impact of intersectionality. It's crucial in addressing systemic hate and inequity and racism. Our African Nova Scotian community partners have made a number of statements, and they gave recommendations and they gave safeguards. They gave it to the government in the previous bill that was an overreach, and yet we don't see it in this bill at all. You had a template. You could have just put it in the bill.
Order. I would ask the member to talk to me, to talk through me to the government. Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize. Not like they were looking at me, but it's okay. I will direct it to you. Absolutely. So I just want to say that, you know, we have to remember that we are a demonstration of leadership, and we should have a commitment to equity and anti-racism. And I wait to see how this government will show that in the legislation put forward, moving from now until forward. So now that I've spoken in detail about these changes and the things that we need to see, some of us may have actually listened to my words, and I'm hoping, because I have to say this because it feels like no one's listening, and when no one's listening, you got to repeat yourself, right? So I just want to say that I'm hoping. That's how it goes, right? You all have an understanding of my concerns, but yet the African Nova Scotian community's concerns. It is on record, and it's been on record from previous, which hopefully at some point, not hopefully, we need to do better. We absolutely, as a government, the government of Nova Scotia has to do better, and we can't keep acting like we don't know and we don't see, because this is the reality. So I want to remind all members that as this bill, as many others, the volumes to the lack of diversity and acknowledgement and understanding of the adversity and barriers that the African Nova Scotian communities experience, and we have a piece of legislation that speaks directly to this behavior and how it is disrespectful and requires urgent action to this matter. The Progressive Conservative Party needs to read and acknowledge that this bill goes against the act that they have. It should be brought back to the table. It should be brought back to the department. It should be brought back to whoever creates the piece of legislation and be viewed under an equitable lens, because it is harmful and completely disrespectful towards our African Nova Scotian community leaders who've been doing this work for a long time, to our councillors who have been working in conjunction with these communities to make sure that their voices are heard in legislation, in planning, and bylaws. And I will say it again. Does this PC government want to be remembered as a party that continues to undermine and overreach the African Nova Scotian communities, and HRM, because in this act, the government has recognized that marginalized and racialized individuals and communities in Nova Scotia experience harmful, unjustifiable inequities and disparities because of systemic hate, inequity, and racism. So we have, ways to do these pieces of legislation, and I would hope that moving forward, that the changes that were suggested by a number of folks that came to law amendments, that wrote us letters, that created, a cause behind how we need to do things better. I hope that what we're doing is taken into account. So everyone has a vote to cast. If this continues on, what will be yours? I'm hoping that it will be, to go back, take a look at this legislation, re-evaluate it in whatever way that needs to be done. Because you can decide to pull it back and take a look at it, do the right thing. Or you can think about the actions that you make when you vote yes on racism and structural discrimination. So I just want to put that out there. I'm very disappointed in the fact that we continue to say it's all in the name of affordability or faster housing or whatever you want to frame it. But at the end of it all, it also needs to be reflective of the communities in which we serve in Nova Scotia. And if it doesn't speak to that, then we are not doing the right thing, and we need to change this legislation. Thank you, Madam Chair.